Chapter 1. A bit of meat. John Hamman, 43. Cretaceous. God, it was hot, but the heat would bring the animals. They would need water. Hell, he needed water. John Hamman reached down for the canteen, resting beside the pack on which he sat. It was half full. Best to put it out of its misery. This could be a long day. But they had another. He offered it to Manny. The black man smiled and shook his head, as John knew he would. He would not drink until John did, and when he did, he would not drink as much. This was an old ritual between them. How many years had they done this? He had tried getting Manny his own canteen, but Manny had assumed it too was John's, and that he was just carrying it for him. One day, he would get Manny to drink first, before his buana. For now, he lifted the canteen, turning his head so Manny could see him take several large swallows before handing it over. Manny smiled before raising it to his lips, careful to take less than his master. Manny's face seemed to split in two, bisected by his wide grin as if he could read John's mind. John had harbored the suspicion that Manny really did possess such a power. He had accumulated more than a bit of evidence over the years. He even asked Manny once outright, but the man had just grinned even wider, laughing silently just as he did now, laughing at John, just as he laughed at all things great and small. He had never known anyone so happy or content in life. Clearly, Manny's people still possessed a secret that John's had lost. He had never seen a people who took such delight in simply being, regardless of where they were or what they were doing. And to think that John's grandfather had owned slaves. He might well have owned Manny's uncle and called him property. The thought that you could possess such a creature as you might possess a horse or a cow, easier to lay claim to the wind, and yet more than a few people back home would consider Manny to be lower than such animals. John pondered what his own father would think if he could see them sitting here, sharing water from a canteen like brothers beneath the shade of these ferns, as they had done so many times in so many lonely places. He could still remember his father beating him for drinking from the colored fountain. John's father would have an apoplexy if he could have seen his son grow up to spend so much of his life among these people. Manny handed back the canteen. He had drunk just under half of what was in it. John shook his head as he raised it to his mouth to finish the water. Sometimes the best place to keep it was inside you. He could have predicted that no matter how thirsty Manny had been, some things were as certain as the rising of the sun. He put the canteen back in its pocket on the side of the pack. He turned to peer out through the gaps in the large ferns. Even with a good rifle, hunting required a little bit of attention. Best to remember that even though you were the hunter, you could easily become the prey. Nothing had appeared during this short, silent exchange. Manny had already turned back and stared out over the dry plains behind them, a slight smile on his face. John's big double rested across Manny's lap. He had carried it and other guns for John for so long that John could barely remember him without one. There had been a time when John would have taken it from Manny to hold himself so that it might be quickly at hand if in fact something decided to stalk the stalkers. But that time was long past. Like so many things they had never discussed, it was a mark of trust that Manny took more pride in than any authority he might ever be given. That trust had never been betrayed, and more than once John had heard the concussion from behind him as a big 10-gauge or rifle was emptied at a charging lion or elephant that had stalked up their trail, intent on mayhem. In his own arms, John cradled the .375. The gun was really too big to shoot meat with, but it had the power to drop anything that might look on them as dinner, and it was a flat shooter. The .375 was like an old friend. He'd had it for a long time, and held it in his arms more often than any woman he had known. The rifle had been made for him in England by Holland, and Holland after the war. The action was superb. It had a long relief scope mounted forward of the action on the barrel. The magnification was only 4 power, but it didn't slow down his shooting up close. John would never admit it to anyone else, but he thought his sight might be getting weaker. He was actually thinking about going in and letting a doctor fit him with glasses. John couldn't see the river from here. There wasn't much to look at anyway. The width was less than a quarter of its size right now. It had been a long, dry season. He didn't want to be that close to the river. Too many things were prone to show up there, being the only source of water in the immediate area. No, right now, John wanted a bit of meat and a little privacy, and he would not get that at the river's edge. To the west of him, the low escarpment that overlooked the river bottoms was broken by a slope leading to the water. Above was a drier plain. The drop-off wasn't huge, but enough to make the slope to his west somewhat attractive. He was actually a good way from it, better than a quarter mile, but there would still be more traffic here, as wildlife made the trek toward the water. Perhaps he was being overly smart. John liked to think of it as being subtle. He hoped it would not look like a trap, mainly because it wasn't much of one. He was essentially sitting in the middle of an open plain, a spot he hoped would see a bit more traffic. Then again, perhaps he had overestimated the use the path received, but it's like they say, you only need one. And in the afternoon, their vigilance was rewarded. The herd was small, 7 in all. They were headed for the river in a slow, meandering path. They would want to drink their fill and be away before it became too cool. The hunters preferred early evening. There were 4 females, a bull, and only 2 calves, not many young. It had been a hard year, hard for bigger herds to find food, and small herds were more vulnerable to predators. This group had probably lost at least 1 or 2 calves already, and they might lose 1 more member today. It all depended on how close they wandered to his patch of ferns. John thought about moving toward their path, but he couldn't do it without being seen. How would they react? He wouldn't normally be a threat. He thought about simply standing and casually wandering in a path that would cross in front of the herd to get a bit closer. They might ignore him, or they might veer away. Some things spend their lives hunting. Some things spend their lives being hunted. Both get very good at what they do. Better to sit tight. He didn't like to watch animals that he was stalking too closely. Some of them seemed to have more senses than they should. Watching would not make them take a path nearer his hide, and it might hurt his chances if they felt his gaze on them. He had seen Manny freeze, sensing prey or danger, when there was absolutely no way he could have known. Hell, John had felt it himself at times and learned to trust it. So he turned and sat, not looking at the herd and trying not to think murderous thoughts. John waited perhaps 10 minutes before he turned to check on what he hoped would be their dinner. Not so bad. As far as he was concerned, they could walk right up and graze on his bush. They weren't overly bright. It looked like they would pass nearby. He settled himself down to wait. He opened the bolt and emptied the magazine of the 300-grain solids. The reach would be a bit long, and he wanted a good boat-tail bullet. He reached into the left pocket of his vest and pulled out 3 cartridges, over 3.5 inches long. The more pointed 270-grain Spitzer bullets would not slow down and would reach farther with less drop. He had long ago sewn tubes into the backs of his pockets. He didn't like the idea of brass glinting in the sun. He put the 3 rounds in the magazine and closed the bolt, watching the Mauser action, strip the first round, and lock it into the chamber. The bolt felt smooth as silk, no sign of sand or dirt in the action. He flipped on the safety. John looked out to the north, thinking about where they would likely pass and where he would take his shot. The wind was light out of the northwest. Not much of a crosswind, not for the heavy bullet. It would leave on its way at over 2,700 feet per second. While he had the time, he tried to estimate the distance to different points. The shot was going to be a bit of a reach. Careful to stay behind cover, he peered through the scope at a cycad that was kind enough to present itself. He was zeroed at 300 yards. The bullet would break around 200, where it would be only about 5.5 inches high, but after it passed through his zero, it would start to drop hard. He motioned silently to Manny, who came forward and knelt where he indicated. Kneeling behind him, he lay the rifle upon Manny's right shoulder as if it were a shooting rest high enough that he would be able to shoot above the brush. He could not make such a long shot unsupported. He again scoped the target area and made his final decisions as to how high he would hold, depending on their path. It could be from as little as 13 inches to as much as 3 feet at the far side of the clearing. He guessed it would take up to 3/4 of a second for the bullet to reach the target. He took one last long look through the gaps in the ferns. Yes, the herd was coming. Yes, they were staying in the open, away from the cover, along the path he had guessed. They would pass through the clearing he had chosen. He settled down on his knees behind Manny to wait. He didn't want to have to move once they were closer. Manny could probably do this forever, but John became uncomfortable, aware of a pebble under his left knee. He gently wiggled his knee to the side to relieve the pain. Finally, he caught sight of the leader of the herd, a bull, followed by what was probably the alpha female and her calf. John watched their gait as they passed, counting, trying to estimate the lead he would need on the shot. They were passing through the far side of his range. It would be a long shot. He wanted one of the females without a calf. One of them passed, followed by the second mother. He would take the last one. She was slightly smaller than the others. He concentrated on taking long, deep breaths. As she entered the clearing, he started to track with her. He had almost 20 seconds as she crossed the clearing to take his shot. He would try for behind the shoulder, the heart, and lungs. He didn't trust the drop enough to go for the spine. He focused on the hold over and began to pick up the lead as he followed with her. The gait was a little uneven, but he tried to average it out. All the world disappeared outside of the ring of his scope and the sound of his breathing. Manny had done this for him so many times over the years that they needed no words. Without being told, he started to pick up John's breathing, in and out with him. When John paused, smoothly exhaling half of his breath, Manny did the same. He didn't pull the trigger. It chose to break all on its own, clean and crisp, as he pressed back on it. All John knew was that the world had changed. Firing a big gun was a rude experience. There is no way to stay on your target. It's like a discontinuity in the universe. He was throwing the bolt, pulling the long action all the way to the rear, ejecting the case onto the ground next to him, and stripping another round from the magazine into the chamber. He got back on the scope as he heard a meaty thud echo back to him. Running animals, rising dust. It was hard to see. The cover near the ground hid her from view, but she was down, kicking in the dust, raising a cloud that did not follow with the rest of the herd. Better than he had hoped for. If she stayed down, they would not have to chase her. He did not know where he had hit. Maybe he did get the spine after all, but she wasn't running. Manny turned back to him with another enormous grin. Once, John might have tried to pretend that he had planned that shot placement, but they were long past that. He shrugged, lifting the rifle off its resting place on Manny's shoulder. Now the question, sit and wait or go and see. From here, he would at least have good line of sight on her if she got back up. If they started to move in, they would lose sight of her. Better to wait and see. If she wanted to lie there and bleed, he was not inclined to dissuade her. He laid the rifle on his pack and got out the other canteen for another drink. There might be whiskey tonight at the camp, but the water passed back and forth between them was the real celebration. It looked like she was going to stay down, maybe take her last nap. He decided to send Manny back to the camp for porters to help carry the meat. It was best to have a bit of help when you butchered a dinosaur.